Hey everybody, it's Dami and Jamie, and we are here in Continental Square in York, and we're bringing you a new episode tonight called Fighting Frenchman Lafayette's Brief Visits Left Long Legacy in York County.
So you probably know a lot about Lafayette because he left a lot of legacies on our landscape. We have an amazing sculpture that's right down the street in West Market. There used to be a club right up the street called the Lafayette Club that is now owned by the Center for Community Engagement. There is also the most beautiful banquet room at the York Revolution Stadium named after him. There's a street at WellSpan Park. But do you actually know about this man who's left this legacy in York County?
Right. So we always bring you an agenda, and first up we're going to talk about Lafayette's first visit to York, which actually happened all the way back in 1778. The second visit, which we just celebrated yesterday, was in 1825. Then we're going to talk about York's funeral for Lafayette, and then opposing viewpoints about him.
So yeah, did he really do the toast? There are some people who question that. And we are right at Continental Square because right behind us you'll see that there is a historical marker that goes into the Globe Inn and specifically reference Lafayette. So we'll talk about his second visit here. We always have a takeaway, so here's kind of our thesis of this episode. That is that Marquis de Lafayette played a crucial role in the Revolutionary War. As a Continental Army general, he fought bravely alongside George Washington on the battlefield in some of the darkest moments in the American Revolution. He also influenced France in backing our young nation, which tipped the war in our favor, and that is why York County remembers him so fondly.
Yeah, so we're going to start with some background information. So his name is Marquis de Lafayette, and that might tip you off that he was born into a noble family. But he found himself orphaned in his early teenage years, and because of his family's immense wealth, he ended up inheriting a ton of money. And he used that money to come to America and join the Revolutionary War.
Very cool. While he had some connection to King Louis XIV, it was because of his noble birth. He really had no combat experience, and he was actually still a teenager, which blows my mind.
I know.
Nonetheless, he was appointed as the Major General in the Continental Army, where he bonded with the Commander-in-Chief George Washington. So here we have an orphaned Frenchman and then a childless general. So you can see that they had a father-son relationship bonding.
Yeah, so Lafayette first came to York in January of 1778, and he wanted to be commissioned to lead a raid in Canada in an area that had been imperialized by the British. So he met with Continental Congress right here in York Square, which used to be the site of the courthouse. And back then it was called Center Square, so it looked a little different than what it is today. But you can picture teenage Lafayette just showing up in York and knocking on the door.
Hey, am I in the right spot?
Yeah.
So the bottom line is that Continental Congress needed Lafayette's support. His partnership meant that France would be an ally of ours against a fight against the Redcoats and the British.
I just want to take a moment. Jamie's wearing the French-American Alliance cockade. So this is a cockade that would have shown that she was supportive of the relationship between France and America.
And I would have worn this on my shirt, on my
on your dress, on a hat,
coat,
really anything. Yeah, it was just really to show off that pride and the alliance between the two countries.
And Dami, you did a event last night with Lafayette, right?
Yes, we had Lafayette here for the 200th anniversary of his trip to York City on the day, February 2nd, 1825, and we were right here in the square. We had a fife and drum corps from the middle school.
So cool.
The news was here. The mayor gave a proclamation. So, we tried to make it as grand as it would have been all the way back in 1825.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah.
Cool. So when we're thinking about Continental Congress and how much we depended on him, again, we want to point out that this was a 20-year-old, 20 years old. I don't know what you were doing at 20 years old, but I was not.
I was not going to different countries, joining the army, fighting for independence.
Right. So General Gates, he held this big banquet, what is today known as the Gates House, which is right down the road at Plow Tavern. And the Board of War Chair invited a lot of dignitaries to come and eat, including Lafayette, in addition to many of Washington's enemies.
Yeah, so before we go and start talking about the toast, we want to get into some of the background of the Conway Cable and some of the enemies. Cabal, I apologize. So General Gates and his crew were not loving the American commander George Washington at the time. So, that can get a little dicey when you don't always agree with each other.
Definitely not. There were a bunch of military officers and congressmen who wanted to replace the commander of the Continental Army, George Washington, and they wanted to replace him with Major General Horatio Gates. I want to tell you that when I speak, I look at you, Dami, because I feel like I'm talking to you in the camera. So there was this general, and his name was Thomas Conway, and he led this loose-knit conspiracy known today as the Conway Cabal. He was an Irishman, and he led a brigade in Washington's army, and he really didn't like the way that Washington was making choices in the Battle of Brandywine, and under the troops under Washington's command weren't winning also, which kind of is a bad look. And then you have next to that Horatio Gates, who was coming off a major triumph in the Battle of Saratoga, and this was considered by many scholars the turning point of the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So you can see why some people are like, maybe we should get rid of this Washington and bring in this Horatio Gates guy.
And I have to say, Marquis de Lafayette, with his really close connection and relationship with George Washington, when I showed him the Horatio Gates house and the tavern, he was like, "Oh, we celebrate him here."
Yes, we do. Cool piece of architecture, right?
He understood. So the moment then came for all of these toasts, and Lafayette noticed that no one saluted Washington, and you can imagine that didn't make him very happy.
Kind of bad look.
So he rose up and he offered a toast to Washington. And remember, this represented our really important alliance with France. This was a Frenchman, and he was toasting to our general, the most famous general in the United States. And the story goes that the dinner guests flushed and joined by raising their glasses along with Lafayette. So I think they were a little chagrined and embarrassed that, like, oh my gosh, this really influential person caught us not toasting and giving accolades to the general.
And you need to make him like you, or else he's going to leave with all of his French troops.
Yeah, you know, first impressions or just impressions in general were really important.
So York thus became the town where this young adult with the list of his hand backed Washington amid a conspiracy to overthrow him.
Yes.
Some believe that the Conway Cabal faded after this toast. Others say that it was already kind of dying anyway. Regardless, though, after the toast, Lafayette departed York. He headed to New York. He commanded then the American attack. Well, the plan was to command the American attack on the British. Unfortunately for him, though, some of the troops and supplies that Gates and the Board of War promised him were missing. So he didn't go to Canada, but rejoined Washington in Valley Forge.
Right. So that takes us into his second visit to York. So Lafayette ends up coming back to York in February of 1825. And at first, he just passed through on his way to Harrisburg, which we also recreated this weekend.
Yeah, you were up in Harrisburg too?
Yeah, we were in Harrisburg. We were in York. I was taking him all around, showing him central Pennsylvania. But then he ended up returning, and this time they toasted Lafayette. So Lafayette rode with his son, who was named George Washington Lafayette.
I love
so that goes to show, you know, how special that relationship between the two of them were. And in the carriage of the prominent Yorker, John Coons. So hundreds of Yorkers lined the streets to applaud him. And that's where we're going to show you Lewis Miller's painting. If anyone watches Hometown History, Jamie and I love Lewis Miller. He's one of the only artists that show you what everyday life in New York was like. And it's amazing that he has almost the snapshot of time, you know.
Yes, the 19th century influencer.
Yeah, I mean, this would have been like an Instagram reel back then.
So there was a great reception held right here at the Globe Inn. At some point it was torn down and it was rebuilt in 1812 by this building behind us. This is the Rupp building. It is today the place of Prince Street Cafe, one of my favorite places to
We
go
go there a lot
coffee.
to talk shop
Yes,
about
we do.
hometown history.
And about 100 people joined this gathering telling stories of this French nobleman who supported Washington.
Yeah. So when Lafayette's turn came to make his toast, he lifted his glass and he said, "The town of York, the seat of the American Union. In our most gloomy times, may its citizens enjoy in the same proportion their share of American prosperity."
Yes,
very nice. I sounded like him?
You did, actually.
I need a French accent.
I think you can be his reenactor.
Yeah.
And then we want to point out too very quickly that he went down to Shrewsbury. Here is where he stayed at the Blue Ball Inn. So this guy made it around York. It was not, or York County, it wasn't just in York. So now let's get into his death. So unfortunately, he is going to pass away. It was 9 years after he was here at the Globe Inn. The townspeople again celebrated Lafayette, but this time there was a tinge of remorse in the air because he had passed. He had died at 76 years old, and he was buried in France. York streets were lined with a funeral ceremony, and it was quite this elaborate ceremony. Here's another painting of Lewis Miller. There was a band, there was a military escort, and a mock hearse drawn by 4 black horses.
You know, it'd be really interesting today if we celebrated or honored our politicians or war heroes with mock funerals when we didn't necessarily have the ability to have the body. You know, like they lie in state in DC, but none of the other cities will have
That is interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's because like you now can watch it happening, so
Right.
there's a sense of closure, whereas in the 1800s you couldn't watch it, so
You had to
people
create it.
You had to create your own closure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way to look at it. So this ended up being the third and final toast to the man who had previously raised his glass in two meaningful moments in our town here in York. One historian wrote, there was an imposing ceremony and one of the most solemn occasions in the history of York.
Yep.
And then we have a picture from Lewis Miller.
Yeah, that I went
we already
over.
showed
Yeah,
it.
yeah, sorry, but I jumped
That's
out a
okay.
little bit.
We jumped a little ahead, but that was Lewis Miller's rendition again of the funeral.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this brings us to the final part of our agenda. We went over the first time Lafayette came, the second time he came, the funeral, but there are some skeptics as to whether the toast happened or at least how significant it was. So there's some local historians, including our mentor, Jim McClure, who believe that it happened, but there's really not a lot of factual evidence to back up all the myths that we tell about Lafayette.
Right.
So first, Lafayette is the only source of the toast. He's
Okay.
the only source that this thing happened,
Yes.
which as a historian, you can't cross-reference, and
Right.
that's already problematic. And then second, that reference doesn't appear until 1829,
Yeah.
51 years after it supposedly
Mhm.
happened. And then it was only mentioned a second time in 1837 with a posthumous release of his memoirs.
So all Lafayette actually claimed was that he was embarrassed by them making him drink to the health of their commander-in-chief. And we also don't know the exact location of the meeting between
Yeah.
Lafayette and the Board of War. So we may presume it was at the Gates House on West Market Street, but there isn't really enough historic evidence to prove
To really
it.
back
You know,
that
there's
up.
not like a map that says we stood here.
Yeah.
But we can assume,
I
and
wish they would have.
wouldn't that be
history a lot
wonderful?
easier.
Yeah, I mean, during that time when someone like Lafayette came to town, there were these amazing descriptions in the newspaper,
Mhm.
and they did say, you know, like these people were there, but they couldn't give you a exact word for word
Yeah.
account, and a lot of times those accounts were written days, if not weeks later.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're gonna embellish a little bit, make it sound a little more
And
exciting
that's what
than
makes
it really
history
was.
sometimes kind of hard to study.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then what do we know as fact? For one is that we know he met with the Board of War in 1778, and that same January day was when he wrote that letter to Congress where he laid out all of his requirements, that hey, if he's going to go to Canada, here are the things that he needs. And he also said though that if my demands aren't met, that he would return home to France. Like that was his threat. And again, as a 20-year-old, like that's brazen.
He's
right?
ballsy, yeah.
And then what's really important is that it wasn't just him returning, but all the French officers in the army.
He was holding some big cards with that one.
Yep.
Yeah.
In that letter that he wrote, he makes no mention of the banquet or the toast. He does, however, mention that Gates's response to it was that he was an odd fellow scratching his wig.
1700s insults.
Right, yeah, the comment section. That's what you're reading.
You know, people think times are so different. They're really not. They're really not. You know, so how did the tale of Lafayette become so large here in York? This local mythology toast began in the late 1800s, and historian Scott Butcher states that the legend seemed to grow over time. By 1907, we called it the toast that saved Washington's job. So we really, you know, thought it was amazing. So by 1927, the toast that ended the Conway Cabal, and by 1950, Lafayette is portrayed as slamming his glass against the wall following his toast. So, you know, the fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the story goes. So I don't know if I'd put a lot of stock in him throwing the glass against the wall.
Yeah, but some people do believe it.
Yeah.
I am a little skeptical of that. So we want to point out that there are very few sculptures of real people depicted in York City. Really only two. There's this one, and we're timestamped at 4:15. If you know the other sculpture,
Put it in
add
the
it to the comments. Actually, I'm not even going to tell him. I'm not going to tell him. You have to go look it up. What is the other sculpture that's based off of a real person, not a symbol?
Try to answer without using Google first, though. And then we're not going to give you a prize, but you'll get bragging rights.
Yeah, but Lafayette though is one of these sculptures, which side note, my grandma made, which is super cool. Yeah.
Her grandma.
My mom. Her real name is Lorraine Jacobs, or she's mom to me, so she made the sculpture.
And I have to say that the Friends of Lafayette came obviously with their Lafayette interpreter, and they were impressed by the statue.
Good.
So Mom
Nice.
should be proud.
Did her history research.
Yes.
Dami and I have a whole separate episode where we interview her and we talk about Lafayette sculpture and her research behind it. So I'm sure can add a link that below.
Yeah.
But the reason why we have sculpture of him is because we want to remember him him, which
Yes.
brings us to our takeaway.
Yeah, so Marquis de Lafayette played a crucial role in the Revolutionary War, and as a Continental Army general, he fought bravely alongside George Washington on the battlefield in the darkest moments of the American Revolution. And I want you all to know that he shed blood here on the battlefield. He actually had some wounds, and this wasn't just someone that went out there and was able to ride his horse through the battle and come away unscathed. So he really, he paid in his blood. So he influenced France in backing our young nation and tipped the war in our favor. And because of this, York County remembers him fondly, as we should.
Now, before he died, even when he went back to his homeland, he became a key figure in the French Revolution. He even helped draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Yes.
His dedication to liberty and democracy spanned both nations, these two nations, America and France, which is why he's been called the hero of two worlds. So we hope that you know a little bit more now about this man that you've probably passed 100 times while driving up West Market.
Yeah, he's not just a character in the Hamilton musical. He was a real person.
He's a real person.
So next episode is going to be March 13th at the Children's Home of York, and that one's open to the public. So check out our Facebook page for more information on that, and then let us know if you're going to come see us in person.
Save the date, March 13th, open to public, so we hope to see you there.
See ya.